Hi everybody. My name's Helen Close. I am the chair of Drone Wars UK, and I'm chairing this panel discussion this evening. Thanks very much to everybody for coming along. It's really great to be able to launch this new report from Spacewatch. It's called Waste of Space, the Environmental Cost of Human Activities in Space. I've had a read through the report and, I think it is excellent. So this webinar this evening will last approximately 90 minutes. We'll hear from our three panelists discussing the various issues raised in the report. That'll be for about 45 minutes. And then we'll have time for questions from the audience and then wrap up at the end. Please write any questions you've got in the Q&A box, and I'll pose them to the panelists. And just to let you know that we are recording this webinar, and it'll be available via the Space Watch website for you to have a look at. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce the three panelists we've got this evening. We have Peter Burt from Spacewatch UK. He's the author of this new report. He'll speak about some of the problems that are outlined in the report. Then we've got Dr. Jill Stuart from the London School of Economics. She's an expert in ethics and law of outer space exploration and exploitation. And then also Dr. Doug Parr, who's the Chief Scientist and Policy Director at Greenpeace UK. Both of those will speak about some of the solutions and suggest possible ways forward. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Peter Burt. Very much looking forward to hearing about the report, Peter.
Thanks, Helen. Having very carefully set up my presentation before we started, I now realise that I haven't actually got it ready to go. So just bear with me a second, please. Sorry about that. Okay, I hope you can see the first slide of the presentation now. Great. So, as Helen said, tonight we are going to talk about the global environmental impacts of the space industry. There have been various academic reviews looking at this topic, but as far as we're aware, this is the first study on the subject that has been published for a general audience. So I'm going to set the scene by setting out what some of the environmental concerns relating to the space industry are, especially the impacts on various global commons. And then, as Helen said, Jill and Doug will discuss some of the possible ways forward. So the context behind all of this is that the modern global economy is very dependent upon space, and it affects many aspects of our everyday life through communications, GPS, Earth observation for weather forecasting, etc. This slide gives an idea of the breadth of some of the ways in which space is important to us. What we've seen is that the space sector is growing rapidly. Gone are the days of the 60s and the 70s when only a couple of governments had the technical ability to launch objects into space. Nowadays, the sector is dominated by commercial companies and the military. And this chart shows the number of launches each year since 1957. If you look at the graph, you can see that since 2020, growth has been exponential. There's been a hockey stick-like takeoff in launch numbers, and more satellites were launched in the past 5 years than in the previous 60 years combined. Until recently, the relatively small number of launches meant that the space industry's impacts were predominantly local. But as the industry grows, this is no longer the case, and the industry may now be having an impact at a global level. One of the problems is that there is considerable uncertainty about how these impacts will play out, and there's little awareness even within the space sector about them. So let's start by looking quickly at some of the local impacts. Space industry infrastructure, ground infrastructure such as spaceports, launch sites, and ground stations for transmitting and receiving data to satellites. They're often located in remote and therefore unspoilt locations. And this photo shows the sensitive peat bog habitat in Caithness in Scotland around the site of the proposed Sutherland spaceport. As well as impacts on the environment, spaceport developments may also have divisive impacts on local communities because some people will inevitably benefit while others lose out. Another concern is what happens to debris from space rocket launches, rocket stages and boosters and such like. Usually this is just abandoned at sea, where it may damage fishing gear and will eventually corrode and release contaminants. This photo shows debris from the Space Shuttle Challenger accident, which was found at the bottom of the ocean by divers more than 30 years after the disaster. The point here is that no other industry is allowed to abandon its waste at sea, so why isn't the space industry required to recover its debris? So far, these have all been fairly local impacts. So let's move on and look at the space industry's impacts on global commons, by which we mean the Earth's atmosphere and space orbits and dark and quiet skies, things which no one can really own, which are kind of common to all of us and available for all of us to benefit from. And I hope that this photo will help demonstrate that space launches can have an impact on the atmosphere. It was taken after the launch of a SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket in California in July 2023. And the attractive looking red glow that you can see, which looks like an aurora, is not a natural effect. It's a temporary effect caused by the effect that the exhaust gases from the rocket have on natural ions in the atmosphere. So if you're interested, you can read about the science behind this in the report. But the point I want to make here is that rocket launches can have an impact on the atmosphere, and so can space debris and old satellites which fall out of orbit and burn up in the atmosphere. So here's a schematic diagram showing the layers of the atmosphere. The troposphere, the lowest level, which goes up to about 10, 20 kilometers, roughly the height at which aircraft fly. That's impacted by human activities on the ground, as is the stratosphere, where the ozone layer is. Above this, in the mesosphere, the middle atmosphere, and the upper atmosphere, the space industry is the only source of human pollution. Now, we only know a limited amount about these regions of the atmosphere, and there's considerable uncertainty about the impacts that the space industry has on the chemistry of these parts of the atmosphere. What we do know, though, is that combustion products from rocket launches can have climate impacts. Now, these emissions are far smaller in quantity than emissions from the aviation industry, but they're introduced into a different part of the atmosphere, and they operate through different pathways. The type of combustion product that we get depends on the type of rocket fuel, but products such as black carbon, soot, water vapor, and products such as aluminium oxide and hydrochloric acid, they all make a net global warming contribution. Also very important are metal residues produced as metal components of spacecraft burn up in the atmosphere. These have a catalytic effect, and because they're catalysts, they persist in the atmosphere. They're not destroyed, but they can catalyze the destruction of ozone. We also see that the intense heat which is generated as rockets launch and satellites burn up also generate nitrogen oxides from nitrogen in the atmosphere, and these can also deplete the ozone layer. So what's happening is that the growing space industry has the potential to add to loadings of greenhouse gases and ozone disrupting chemicals in sensitive parts of the atmosphere. And we don't know how significant these impacts will be. Again, the report goes into a lot more detail on this and the science behind it, but the key point here is that the atmosphere isn't a self-cleansing system, and foreign substances that we put into it aren't just going to vanish by magic. Time is short, so I would like to turn now to the issue of space debris. Over the decades, considerable quantities of objects have accumulated in various orbits, and many of these are redundant. So, for example, defunct satellites that no longer work, and their components, and bits of launcher debris. And these objects remain in orbit, and they can act as a collision hazard to other satellites. What's worse is that if they do collide with something, then the collision will generate fragments, which in turn will add to the risk of collision in future. So what we can find is that in some congested orbits, this can generate a sort of self-sustaining cascade of collisions, a little bit like a radioactive chain reaction, which in time could render the orbit unusable. This effect is known as the Kessler syndrome. This is a photo from NASA, and it shows damage caused to the armored windshield of a space shuttle by a tiny fleck of paint. Although very, very small, the fleck was traveling at a very high speed and collided with the windshield with the energy of a grenade exploding, causing this crater in the thick armored glass. Now, the space industry is aware of this threat and is concerned about space debris. This image was produced for modelling space debris issues by the European Space Agency to demonstrate the distribution of space debris. And you can see that in some highly used orbits, for example, geosynchronous orbits where a satellite stays in the same place relative to the ground below, then there's a concentration of debris. And there's a risk that these orbits may become compromised and unavailable for use by future generations. Now, the space industry's solution to this problem is to either park redundant satellites in a higher orbit, which is merely deferring the problem until satellites in that orbit decay, or to allow it to fall out of orbit. And this photo shows waste packages being ejected into the atmosphere for disposal from the International Space Station. So you can probably work out that this doesn't really help. If they burn up, then the objects are just going to add to metal loadings in the atmosphere and increase atmospheric chemistry impacts. Bigger objects which don't burn up, are going to fall into the ocean and are usually targeted on a remote and therefore pristine area of the Pacific Ocean. Let's talk now about what we call dark and quiet skies. Humans have always been fascinated by the night sky. I'm sure every one of us on this call has looked up into the sky and tried to spot the stars and the constellations. And the night skies have a deep and fundamental relationship with human culture. And this is a photo of an amazing historical artifact called the Nebra Sky Disk. It's a bronze disc around 3,600 years old, which was found in Germany. And you can see that it appears to represent the night sky. And researchers have concluded that it shows symbols representing the sun and the crescent moon and stars, including a grouping that appears to be the Pleiades constellation. So the night skies are important to human culture, and satellite constellations reflect sunlight, and this can change the appearance of the night sky. That doesn't just have an aesthetic impact, it can also have impacts on wildlife navigation and human health, which again, we don't really understand as yet and may be difficult to foresee. Sunlight reflected from satellite constellations can also leave light trails, which obscure details on images of the night sky, as you can see in this picture taken by astronomers. Radio signals from satellites can also interfere with astronomical observations, and astronomers all around the world have started to raise concern about the impact of growing numbers of satellites on their science. So these are some of the environmental threats that are resulting from expansion of the space industry. Our report, the Waste of Space report, goes on to outline steps which we think can help turn the situation around. For example, defining planetary boundaries, which we can stay within to help ensure that our activities are sustainable. We talk about introducing new regulatory instruments to control what the space industry can and can't do. We also emphasize ethical approaches within the space industry and STEM education. And we also talk about decoupling space from the military, because the military is a big driver and funder of the space sector and should be decoupled from the civil sector to prevent the militarization of space. Now, we can expect all of these steps to be resisted by the governments, by the billionaires, by the generals who run society. So most important of all, what we need is citizen action, citizen engagement to push for a new approach to space. And scientists have a key role to play in mobilizing this. We'll talk about this more in the next part of the webinar and also in the Q&A session, no doubt. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks very much, Peter. That's all really interesting. It's starting to see the impact that such small bits of space debris can have on items already in space. But without, just a reminder, please put any questions that you've got for Peter in the Q&A box. If you can't see the Q&A box, it might be under the more settings at the bottom of your screen. Without further ado, I'll pass over to Jill. Please go ahead, Jill.
Great. Can you see my screen?
Yeah, that looks great.
Okay, except that it's not transitioning. Sorry, I'm just going to oh, there we go. Okay, there we go. Yeah, okay. Yeah, thanks so much for having me. So I'm Dr. Jill Stuart. I'm a specialist in the politics, ethics, and law of space exploration and exploitation. And I was really flattered to be asked to be involved in this event tonight, launching this report. And I think it's a really good report. I'm going to talk a little bit more at the end about the utility of it. But I just want to say, so I was asked to talk about regulation because that's my specialism, and I am going to talk about that. But I also want to start by saying that this is an area that is really important to me. I've been researching in this area for a long time, and space sustainability is something that is increasingly part of the conversations, and I think that's really important. Aside from having the privilege of being involved with organizations like Spacewatch, I'm also involved with the Royal Astronomy Society's discussions around dark skies. And so these discussions around whether or not we can, whether or not mega constellations are disrupting our vision into space. So I think that these are all just really important. I am going to talk about regulation in a minute, which is what I was asked to talk about. But I just wanted to say that one thing that I have found in my own research over the years that is interesting is this feedback loop about space and Earth, and how the two potentially synergize. So sort of when we look out, we end up looking back in. We search the universe to discover ourselves. So this is an image that many people will be familiar with from 1968, the Earthrise photo. I put it in this orientation. This is actually the orientation that was taken by the crew, the Apollo crew, when they saw Earth from the moon. 1990, this is the image. It's just, you can just see the pale blue dot that is Earth. The point being to me that actually space activity has inspired a lot of the environmental movement, which I think is quite ironic because now we're in a situation whereby space activity is causing problems for the environment. But I don't think that it needs to be an either or with space activity. Like space activity can potentially help us understand the Earth environment and get this broader picture. The report mentions something, I don't think it says the words specifically, but about people who have been in space appreciating how seeing Earth collectively without borders. This is something that in the literature we call the overview effect. So I think that space has always had this kind of interesting relationship with the environmental movement. Again, where it has enforced it, things like being able to monitor space, Earth problems from space have had a positive effect collectively, but at the same time, now we're seeing where space activity is having potentially negative effects. So those are just some general thoughts, but what I'm here to talk about is space governance and regulation. So for those who are familiar with the report, but also many of you on the call will be familiar with the background of space legislation, but I'm going to go through it really quickly here. So space is basically governed, the space legal infrastructure consists of 4 main treaties. The most important one is the Outer Space Treaty of 1967. And this said that outer space was neutral territory. So it was based on ideas around the high seas. So it was also very much a product of the bipolar conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union. But the outcome was that we decided that outer space is neutral territory. And one of the things that I'm going towards is, because I'm meant to be talking about the challenges that we face now. One of the things that I want to say is that we do have a really long-standing historical context about how space is regulated that goes back a long time. So that's the Outer Space Treaty of 1967. In 1968, we had the Rescue Agreement, which said that astronauts are the envoys of mankind, and if they crash somewhere on Earth, you have to be nice to them. In terms of sustainability, what's really important is the Liability Convention of 1971. And what this convention says is that any object that's launched into space remains the responsibility of the launching state. So if a country launches something into space, I think it's interesting because you hear people like Elon Musk now talking about maybe implying that they're outside of the regulation, but in fact, any object that is put into outer space is the responsibility of an individual country. And this was backed up by the Registration Convention of 1973. So any object that goes into space is registered through the United Nations. And so there is this kind of useful train of liability. There are a lot of problems with it. I'm not suggesting that it's perfect in any sense, but I do think that there is this background legal infrastructure that is useful. So whenever you hear people talk about space law, they talk about the 5 main treaties. This 5th one is the Moon Treaty of 1976. I've put that in parentheses because it was not ratified. So the first 4 are largely ratified. Countries have bought into this. They are sort of understood, even when countries try to circumnavigate what these responsibilities are, they still use the language of these treaties. The Moon Treaty of 1976 was meant to kind of unpack what we thought about how to use lunar resources, and it was not widely ratified. So one of the things that I would highlight from this is that going forward, we will not see another major treaty. These 4 treaties, you can tell by the time frame, they were a product of the bipolar system, the Cold War system. Again, I think that they are useful. They form a useful background, but we will not see another major treaty because we have just a complication. There are so many different entities that are now involved in space activity, multi-stakeholders. So what we need to focus on now, I think, is sort of unpacking and overlaying regulation. So what I want to say, though, so we have these 4 treaties. They make a great background, but that's not to say that we haven't had any progress since 1976. So there are still major areas of governance and understanding. In terms of international or multilateral areas of understanding, there are agreements. So, for example, COSPAR, which is the Committee on Space Research, they are an intergovernmental organization that are widely respected. They establish understandings about interplanetary, I'm trying to think of the word that they use, but basically, if something goes out into space, it needs to be cleaned, and then when it comes back down, it needs to be cleaned. So they are widely respected as an intergovernmental organization that fulfills a role, I think, in terms of providing a technical but also diplomatic purpose in terms of establishing regulation. I'm going to talk a bit more in a minute about the Artemis Accord. So this, again, because we aren't going to see major treaties, we need to be looking at intergovernmental agreements, memorandums of understanding. The Artemis Accords, I'll come to that in a minute. But one of the things that I think is really significant within this report is, so you have the international level and then you have the domestic level. And domestically, individual states need to take a lot of responsibility for the activity of those entities that are acting in space. And this partly goes back to the historic legacy of the international treaty system, giving states responsibility for what is going on with their entities that are in space. You can think of the high seas. So if a ship is on the high seas, that ship flies a flag and they have responsibility. The country of that flag has responsibility for what's going on there. It's not perfect. I'm not pretending that it's even anywhere near perfect, but it does say that individual countries need to take responsibility for things like, so for example, in the UK with potential spaceports, licensing and environmental impact assessments, there's a big onus on individual countries who have the ability, the technological capability to access space to take responsibility for that and to hold entities such as individual companies accountable for that. So again, what are the challenges? So I'm just going to go back. So that's the overview of regulations. What are the challenges in my mind? yeah, so again, there's this mix of international and domestic, but internationally, one of the things that's being challenged right now is with regards to private property rights in space. And so going back to the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, we have said that outer space is neutral territory, nobody can lay claim, but we're in a situation where you will know from potential lunar landings, for example, that I think it's in the near future that we will be looking at extracting resources from celestial territory, and we need to think about the legal and ethical implications of that. The report does a beautiful job of addressing this. My personal opinion is that I think that it's within the recent realm of possibility that we need to think about the I think resource extraction is going to be done in the near future. And my personal opinion is that we should think about, in terms of regulatory infrastructure, what we want for that to happen. Like, who should be allowed to do that? Like, the Outer Space Treaty says that it shouldn't happen, but I think it is going to happen. So I think we should engage with these discussions, for example, around the Artemis Accords, which would allow us to think about how that resource extraction could happen. The other thing that really sits uncomfortably for me is with this asymmetry of access and first mover advantage. So in terms of regulation, for example, with future moon bases, there is a big advantage for countries that can get there first. This has been a long tradition in outer space law. So the countries that get there first kind of have an opportunity to shape what is going to happen going forward. And that's something that I am not comfortable with. But at the same time, I think we need to be realistic in thinking about how the conversations for that go forward. Yeah, those are sort of my notes on that. I just want to end by saying, oh yes, one other thing as I go back to this slide on space treaties. So the United Nations are the organization that brokered these treaties. And one thing that the report notes that I agree with is that the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space is still very much a salient organization. And as we move to this contemporary era of space exploration, where there are multi-stakeholders, there are companies, there are even individuals, tourists, we need to continue to rely on that forum, but also advocate for individuals and non-governmental organizations to have a voice within that. And one of the things that I really like doing is talking to the public, because I think an informed public are really important in this. That brings me nicely to my final comments, which is that I just want to say that I kind of want to end on a note of optimism. So again, I think that we won't have any major treaties. We need to think about how we're going to unpack regulation, overlay it. But also in my work in this area over many, many years, the topic of sustainability has become embedded in what I hear a lot about. And a lot of that is through younger generations. And I just kind of want to say sorry to those younger generations for what we've presented them with, but also thank you for putting this forward and making it a key point. I think that we need to really consider not only the law, but the ethics and also the politics of what we want for our future. And again, reports like this, organizations like this, are about engaging the public, and the public absolutely has a right and an interest in these areas. Just an aside, I wanted to say, I think this report would really be useful for universities. particularly with the case studies. So, Peter, I would like to talk to you a bit about that later. But so again, I've been working in this area for about 30 years, and there is a lot more awareness and interest around space activity. And one of those areas is about sustainability. And this report gives a really lovely, accessible, non-pretentious overview. And the case studies as well, I think, would really be useful for a lot of students. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jill. And yeah, a really good point you made there at the end about the use of this by university students. I think that's an excellent thing to think about going forward. Yeah, without further ado, I shall pass over to Doug Parr from Greenpeace UK. Please go ahead, Doug.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Pleasure to talk to you. After England won, got to get that in. So my name's Doug Parr. I am the variously titled Chief Scientist, Policy Director, Climate Advisor for Greenpeace in the UK. I've worked for them for about 30 years. My origins were in science and did a doctorate in atmospheric chemistry, in fact, but then have moved to do a lot of other things since then, a lot of other issues. Thanks very much to Peter and Spacewatch for getting this report together, which I think is really good that you've done it and put it all together in such a way that is accessible and puts all the issues on the table. What I thought I would talk about is about the role of the scientist in this particular thing, but I'll go a little bit wider. I mean, I've been involved in loads and loads of campaigns, not just through the science thing, and I was campaigns director in Greenpeace for a year, but that was about a quarter of a century ago. So it's not like I have no thoughts about campaigns, but I think we know that it's important that the science is part of all this. Partly because we need to know that that's the situation, what the situation is, but partly for lots of people in the West, of course, and in many other places, science still imbues the whole area with a certain amount of moral authority when we're talking about what the problems are. It is not the exclusive source of knowledge by no means, and I'll come on to explain what I mean by that in a moment. So one of the things to note is that a number of these issues that Peter has highlighted are amenable to the mobilization of the scientific community to try and gain some political leverage. I put it that way round because I was a participant in the fights over the ozone layer and the protection of the ozone layer, which were ultimately successful. But we need to be very clear that the reason that science played such an important role was not the science itself; it was the political forces that science was able to unlock. Whether that was with policymakers or with members of the public. And it was campaigning at a time when there was a kind of wave of environmental concern that was coming forward, and it was a global wave, which plays to Jill's point about how there was a photograph that actually made some of this happen. I mean, Greenpeace was started shortly after the Earthrise photograph, so these things do happen. This is how things play. It can play out globally, not just in individual countries. But the mobilization of scientists around the ozone layer was slow because there were cultural differences between 30 odd years ago and now. But it's certainly true to say that the scientific community will want to be cautious in the claims that they make. They will want to have verified, research that they can say supports their position. And sometimes because of the way that, particularly now that the way the funding system works, it may be up to NGOs like Spacewatch to initiate that information gathering, and it puts those scientists on more secure ground. It is not the only way of looking at it. The way of looking at, say, space debris, which Peter talked about, with the wreck of the Challenger and with others, satellites being dumped in the Pacific, is that you can look at it like marine littering. It feels to me like hearing Peter speak was like thinking. It reminded me quite a lot of the oil and gas industry, because they took the attitude that because they were big and important, they could do what they like in terms of ocean dumping, and so they again, back 30 years ago, they wanted to dump oil installations in the Northeast Atlantic that had run out of their time in the North Sea. Now, and it took quite a big international campaign to say, no, that's not okay. But the public do not find that okay. It's like dumping your car in the village pond. Now, if you think of it as a littering thing, it's not really to do with whether it causes harm or not. And you can scientifically examine whether it causes harm, but it is a gross attitude towards the global commons, which I think Peter has been highlighting. And so, by framing it that way, by all means, get the science that shows that there is environmental harm as well. But why should we have trillionaires polluting the global oceans just so they can make some more money? I mean, like, it doesn't matter what the size of the pollution is. It's just that they're doing it when everybody else, if they chucked a tin can in the ocean, could get hundreds of pounds fine for littering. But they're allowed to do it for free, and they're allowed to get away with it. And why that is not remotely fair. The unfairness and the grossness of it matters as much as the environmental damage. That's it. Look, I'm a scientist. I like having evidence of harm if there is harm being done. But already, the framing of the way this has been historically looked at it's a bit like chemicals regulation, in the sense that, hang on, the need to prove there's a problem sits with civil society and NGOs when you're doing the polluting. How is that right? There is a whole apparatus of environmental protection that is not being utilized in order to do this examination. It's up to Peter to go and search it all out. I mean, what a strange way to do it. It's the sort of inverse of the precautionary principle, and all that stuff is baked in to the way in which this is being thought about. Which is none of which is to say I don't think it's really important that the Outer Space Treaty is supported as it should be, because it is about keeping the global commons for everyone as it should be. So when it comes to actually trying to kind of engage and I would use the term mobilize, but I realize some people might not like that, but because that's not what they do, but engage, mobilize scientists in these kind of debates. It is a different kind of thing in different areas that Peter highlighted, depending on what the framing of that issue is. If it's about the ozone layer and the pollution that's causing damage to the ozone layer, then yeah, you really need some scientists to be willing to put their name to and willing to say, yes, we think this is a problem that deserves further investigation, and we should go slow on trying to put more up there until we know what's really going on, unless we harm the global commons. So whereas in other spaces it's maybe not so clear cut what the role of science, the science and scientists is. Let me just go on to say, I mean, there are some tactical considerations around things like this, which is probably just worth checking in on. And because I think my experience over time with different issues is that the different scientific communities have different, how can I put it, different cultural attitudes towards their willingness to say stuff. And these are politically formulated. And so the more evidence there is behind it, the more comfortable scientists will feel putting their name to something publicly. But they may be willing to put their name to something privately if you feel like the sort of politics of it mean that a private representation from a group of scientists is going to play a useful role. Sometimes it will, sometimes it won't. It can vary. And you have to kind of negotiate with the different cultural attitudes to in the different scientific spaces. I think with as I say, with chemicals now, it has become quite common for scientists to feel comfortable speaking out. But the converse to that is actually they may be putting their research careers on the line when most of the funding is coming from a fairly limited set of actors, and actors who don't appreciate people speaking up. So I think over the time that I've been working with Greenpeace, which is 30 odd years, the conservatism within the scientific establishment has shifted from being about are we going too far? Is the science backing this up? To being to the caution being about what does this mean for me? What does this mean for the people who are in my research group who, may not have established jobs and may not feel that they are that they have careers that they can play with in quite such a liberal way. In getting all this, getting communities moving, I mean, there are various tactics one can deploy. You could pay scientists to actually do a report on a particular issue which hasn't been investigated, and that tends to when they find out how bad it is, then they tend to feel a little bit more empowered about speaking out, and finding someone who is supported within the scientific community does just make it a lot easier to get others to join on. I mean, it's actually the same. In some ways, it's the same as politics. If you can get a supportive MP in Parliament who can ask other MPs, then you can get a bit of a movement going. And it's the same kind of true within science. Obviously, there are different dynamics, but there's something quite sort of still quite intensely personal about this kind of gathering and mobilizing of the scientific community to deliver some kind of output either into the public domain or into a private sort of political organization or regulator. So I could say a bit more about kind of thinking through about objectives and how you would make it work. I mean, for example, I would see this working particularly well if one were, I mean, this is spitballing, so brainstorm rules. But I mean, if you were taking Elon Musk to a domestic court under the Liability Convention of 1971, then you could, I know Jill's making a face, but this is brainstorm. That would give you a context for saying, can you please, in the scientific community, sign on to this statement about the damage that it might be doing. So I'm making that comment as a kind of campaign and sciencey person, not as a legal person. But what I'm trying to say is that there's a context within which it is meaningful to put your name as a scientist to a piece, to a statement, to something, and it makes the kind of shall I or shan't I much clearer and more distinguished. Just as the same for any other human being, right? Scientists are all humans in the end, so you have to deal with that kind of human things. Jill seems to think some of them maybe aren't, but they are all, in my experience, they are all. This is as much a human interaction as it is a kind of technical interaction. And people feel safer when they feel like something is at their back, and that doesn't have to be necessarily other people, but it does have to be something. It does have to be evidence. It has to be some kind of moral authority that is on their side before they feel comfortable speaking out. Right, I've gone over 10 minutes, so I'll be quiet. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Doug. That was really really interesting. I think, especially thinking about the pressures that scientists can come under regarding their funding. I'm sure lots of us know people who work at universities that are under threat of redundancies and the like at the moment. Please do write questions in the Q&A. But in the meantime, I'm going to use my prerogative as the chair to ask some questions to the panelists. I'd really like to know more about what we can do as concerned citizens. We had like a list of the different harms from Peter, so about the atmosphere, space debris, dark skies, and harms to oceans. Peter, and to the other panelists as well, is there one particular issue that you think we should focus on, should like be the focus of kind of a campaign, or do you think that they're all equally kind of problematic and all need urgent attention? So Peter, with that question.
Yeah, I think they're all important. I'm probably going to tread a bit on Doug's toes in my answer to this question. It's kind of easiest to campaign on things where you can see tangible harm. So, for example, it's easy to see a photo of rubbish at the bottom of the sea. It's much harder to see chemical residues in the atmosphere and appreciate the harm that they're doing at a global level. Space debris, it's up there, but again, it's much harder to sort of visualize that and see how that's going, see how that's working and how that's affecting you. So I think, to start off campaigning on these issues, it's good to do work on one which is, very obvious, and use that as a way of putting the whole issue of the space industry's environmental performance on the agenda. And the obvious one, as Doug has raised, is the issue of dumping of space waste at sea. The space industry hates it when you call it dumping, but that's effectively what it is. It's unlicensed disposal of waste at sea. No other industry is allowed to do that. As Doug has said, the oil industry is not allowed to do it. The fishing industry is not allowed to do it. The water industry is not allowed to do it. Why should the space industry be allowed to get away with it? So I think this is an issue which would be a good one to sort of start off on, especially seeing as in this country, the UK is, if all goes to plan, this year likely to launch its first spacecraft into space from, the United Kingdom. And especially because the manufacturers of the rocket that will be launched, RFA, Rocket Factory Augsburg, have actually sort of said that they want their products to be recyclable and reusable. So, it's an open door, I think, for us to push and say, well, put your money where your mouth is and deliver on that aspiration. So I think that would be where I would start if I was a kind of campaign planner. But, there are other ways of looking at things as well. And very interested to hear any thoughts that others may have too.
Thanks, Peter. Jill, go ahead.
Yeah, I would just add, one of the phrases that was in the report that I hadn't heard before that I thought was really interesting was space washing. And I thought that was really good. I think we kind of have this tradition of seeing all space activity as being positive, and there needs to be this discussion around the negatives of it. And yeah, so I would just say that I think there is absolutely the possibility of critiquing and through local government and international government of anything that has to do with space.
Thanks very much, Jill. Go ahead, Doug.
Yeah, okay. So I think Peter was very right in what he was saying about the tangibles. And I suppose the only other thing I would throw in to all that is that I mean, one of the things to factor in, and it might be that dumping is still the right way to go here, is that it feels to me like this is a tremendously unregulated territory at the moment in practice, and so any initial campaign is not necessarily just about the level of harm. It's also about re-establishing some principles about governance of the global commons in space, and so it's important. It's one where it stands the most chance of getting some kind of multilateral buy-in. I mean, it'd be lovely to get the UK on board, but with the greatest of respect, that does not going to change a lot in how space is going on, unless it is a platform for going through European Space Agency and involving China and India, and then China, and then I mean, of course, the US is a little challenging at the moment on a lot of multilateral issues. So I don't know what the right route map would be, and the institutional links and how one would move from one place to another. But I think it feels like the objective is, or the meta objective of a campaign, if you like, is the re-establishment of multilateralism as a multilateral legal environment as a norm of space operation. And again, I emphasize that might mean it you still come back to that space dumping thing, but I think it feels to me like we ought to be thinking about that as well.
Thanks, Doug. That's really interesting. Just to kind of, I think, stick with you, Doug, I'd be really, you've been involved in campaigns at Greenpeace for such a long time. I'd be keen to hear about like ideas about, or looking back to the past, are there any kind of lessons we can learn from previous campaigns that have been particularly successful? Or do you think that things have changed so much recently in terms of like the political environment we're in, we really need to try to think of kind of new tactics and new ideas?
That's a big question. I mean, yes, look, we clearly have changed a lot. And if you look at, for example, I mean, the really obvious one, climate. How is climate governed internationally? Well, it sort of isn't really, except not in practice. In theory, there is the UN Climate Convention, and every year there is the COP Jamboree, and world leaders or senior politicians from every country in the world are supposed to show up there and account for themselves. That still has its place, because that is the only international forum where governments have to account for themselves, and if it is imperfect as it is, you still got to do it. Really, it's still an important feature. But if you look at how norms and practices are shifting, it's not through the COP process. It's through coalitions of the willing who are trying to do things kind of outside the COP process, even if the UN is kind of half taking an interest or has a sort of attachment to it. So, and again, this is very imperfect, but there was a methane pledge about climate action where I forget how many countries it is now, but it's over 80 have said they will act on methane. and they will do things to meet the methane pledge of cutting emissions by a third. Now, that didn't come through the COP, it came through a coalition of the willing. And then there were others that were meant to be stitched together about forest protection. Don't go through the COP process. They don't go through the formal negotiation. It's kind of groups of countries coming together saying, yeah, actually, we think protecting forests is a good idea. And I can imagine, particularly with the circumstances that we're in now, with a Trumpian White House and Trumpian type figures in different nationality, in different places, in Argentina and so on, that you need a coalition of the willing, and quite how that would be constructed as a grouping, I don't really know. But it feels like that's more likely to be an effective way of getting something out there than trying to hope you can restart a multilateral process that from the beginning involves the US and China. Because I don't see either of those being particularly willing to play ball at the moment. If you get enough countries behind it, then it might start to become a bit sticky for them if they sit outside these new norms and practices that other countries are establishing. So that's my top of the head thoughts about how you might have to go about it. I'd be interested in other people's thoughts on that, actually, because I'm just coming at it a bit randomly.
Thanks, Doug. And yeah, I appreciate that was a big question. So you did very well with me putting you on the spot like that. I see Jill's got her hands up. I'd love to. Just one more thing, Jill. I think it'd be great to hear about the in response to what Doug's talked about, but also perhaps about the pressures that these rules and regulations are coming under from corporations, and perhaps how what we can do as like activists and researchers to push back against that. I'd be interested in hearing about that.
In a way, it relates to what I was kind of thinking when Doug was speaking. I mean, as somebody who researches in this area, I think it's maybe misunderstanding that there isn't a lot of regulation in this area. This area is really heavily regulated. But what I think is interesting in my research, I have looked at how different countries try to circumnavigate like the letter of the law, but in order to get around what they're doing. And I would imagine for Doug with, so for example, flags of convenience, I think is something that we might see in the future on, so any object launched into space has to have the registration of a particular country. Things like whaling. So if we say you can't extract resources except for research purposes, country. What I think is interesting is that countries tend to justify their actions, but within the language of the law, and the law is there. But I think what else is interesting is this discussion around norms and practices. So you have the law, and then you also have norms and practices. And again, my research has found that countries actually do tend to really value being seen as legitimate in their actions. And one thing with space is that space activity is very expensive. So the countries that are currently capable of being active in space are probably more within the mainstream international community. But it may come to the point where launching objects or things like cyber hacking satellites, you would have rogue states that are able to become active in space. And I think that kind of changes how countries and entities adhere to norms and law. Sorry, that was did I answer that?
There was just a question about the power of corporations.
That's right. Yes. So commercial entities, I think, is really interesting. I think, again, people kind of think that this is something really new. Commercial entities, commercial activity in spaces existed since the 1970s. But what we are now seeing is a huge increase in the number and the money that is going into space activity. So to me, it's interesting to see this tension between the international legal infrastructure, which is very state focused, but says that countries have to take responsibility for their companies that are active in space, and we have this massive increase. It's a little bit boring, but when you talk about liability, there are issues around insurance. So if your object causes damage, then somebody has to pay out. So there are, again, this is where I say that I think we underestimate the degree to which there is regulation. There are chains of responsibility, but there's an interesting question about, I think, where we want to go legally in the future, but also ethically. So yeah, there is a huge increase in the number of companies that are active in space, but they are still the responsibility of their launching state.
Thanks very much. Peter, is there anything you'd like to respond to at all from what Doug and Jill have said?
I think this issue of regulation is important. And Jill, one of the things that you flagged up was that although we have an international law framework, most of the regulatory effort goes on at the kind of, domestic, national level, or even, at a more local level than that. And I think it's really important that in the UK's case, the UK takes up this issue and sets high standards for regulation and, acts as a kind of, as you were saying, Jill, as a somebody who is seen as a good player and, can hold up their head with their reputation on this. I think one of the problems with regulation in this country for the last couple of decades, of course, is that regulators have been under a lot of pressure to be enablers. So, they don't really have the teeth to provide the protections in every case that they need to. They are encouraged by politicians to take a pro-industry view and sort of doff the cap to industry where necessary. Now, that's not really what we want from a regulator who is there to protect public safety, to protect the environment, to protect, in some cases, consumer rights. So we do need to have much more of a thrust in favour of good old-fashioned regulation with a stick and a carrot than we have at the moment. And I think that's important for particularly governments like the Scottish government, which does have a role to play in how the space sector is regulated, which has important powers with relation to marine conservation, marine pollution, the marine environment, and could do more to keep an eye on the space industry and push it in the way that we want it to go in terms of getting its act together. If you haven't seen it, then I really would urge you to have a look at an article in the Ferret web platform that was published a couple of days ago by Rob Edwards there, where he has published some freedom of information response papers from the Scottish Government about relationships between the Saxonwood Spaceport and the Scottish Government, including details of discussions between the First Minister and the spaceport, which show very much that the spaceport are pushing for exemptions from regulations for a free port status and, to be allowed to have a kind of light touch in what they do. I don't think that the people of Scotland want that. I don't think the people of Scotland want a space industry at the cost of a tatty environment and poor standards and the billionaire owners of the industry being allowed to get away with what they want to. So I think it's important that the Scottish government actually recognise that and, are prepared to sort of regulate in a meaningful way the sector and not just fall for the soft soap from the sector's proprietors.
Thanks very much, Peter. And Doug, please go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to pick up on what Jill said, which is that it's not something I'd kind of understood from the report, which is that the Outer Space Treaty still basically has some currency internationally in terms of how players want to engage with it, and they think, oh, we've got to keep it within the framework that the Outer Space Treaty creates, which means that one of the ways of getting into it, if you like, is for going after a country like the UK for their failure to comply. If you can find a way of doing that, and I mean, I don't know the detailed provisions of it, but if in the judgment of international peers that countries should be complying with it and the UK isn't, and there's a supportive public to saying the UK should comply with the law, it should be environmentally responsible, then maybe that would be a way of kind of levering open that regulation issue as a campaign tactic. And there's probably, depending on what the issue is, there would be ways of mobilizing scientists to do that. Now, I mean, again, I emphasize I'm just brainstorming here, just thinking about new ways of approaching it, which hopefully wouldn't be too expensive for anybody, given resources available. But whether that would be an opportunity to move forward.
Thanks, Doug. Jill, do you have thoughts? Please go ahead.
just to say, I appreciate that. I mean, given how long the treaty has been in place, I suspect people have looked at this, but I agree that there is, bad pun, space for resistance, and it's worth looking at where that is. I don't know of any particular test cases. Sorry, I'm thinking, but yeah, I appreciate that.
Thanks, Jill. We haven't really talked much about the UK and Scotland, although Peter did mention it just before. But I just wanted to pick up on, are there particular asks that or expectations we should have of the UK government and the Scottish government? What can we be like asking them to do, especially in relation to this the building of the spaceport in Scotland? If you have any thoughts, Peter.
I think there are a couple of things, one relating to the Scottish government, one relating to the UK government. With the Scottish government is understandably very keen to see the space industry develop, particularly because space locations would be in very rural communities where there is a genuine issue of youngsters sort of leaving and finding jobs elsewhere, which has all kinds of sort of social and negative economic issues for those kind of areas. So it's understandable that the Scottish government and Scottish local authorities should be kind of keen to promote the sector as an answer to that. First thing I would say though is it's not a magic bullet. There's no magic bullet solution, unfortunately, to these kind of complicated social and economic issues. So the Scottish government does need to sort of recognise that, and I think politicians need to recognise that and not place all the eggs in the basket of saying, okay, we're going to invest in the space industry and everything's going to be wonderful. That'll be the end of all of our problems, because that won't be the case. I think it's important as well to remember that, there are communities in the places where the spaceports operate, and these communities have rights, and they are going to be affected by the activities of the space sector. So one really useful thing that the Scottish government could do, for example, is put together a code of conduct or some similar thing about communication and consultation with local people for space, space-related communities. what we've seen, in some space-related communities is there's been very, very poor communication between spaceport operators and launch operators and local communities. That's bad for everybody. It's bad for the spaceport operators themselves because, it doesn't win them support from local people. The Scottish Government could play a very positive role in doing something to kind of help improve that situation. On the national level, the UK level, the Civil Aviation Authority plays an important role in regulating the space sector. And as part of its requirements before issuing, for example, a spaceport license, various licenses involved, it requires the developer to put together an assessment of environmental effects, which is another name for environmental impact assessment. The problem is with all of the assessments that I've seen, which have been put together, and this is not just a problem for the space sector, is that the developer engages a consultant to go away and put together the report for them. The consultant will basically say what they want the developer to say, what they think the regulator will want to hear, and they won't necessarily examine the impact in an effective way. They won't necessarily engage with the issues, and the environmental effects assessment is really nothing much more than just a piece of paperwork. It's not particularly scrutinised by the regulatory authority. If members of the public do take the trouble to respond to the document and highlight issues with it, those issues are generally ignored. So I think the regulators, the CAA in particular, should really kind of up their game when looking at environmental impact assessments, put more effort into challenging them and making sure that they really do provide protections for the environment.
Thanks, Peter. We've got about 10 minutes left, so I would love to hear kind of any final thoughts the three of you have on kind of the issues we've been talking about now today. If it's okay, perhaps I'll go to Jill first and just see if you've got any kind of words to wrap up with.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's been really interesting and interesting getting different perspectives across the spectrum. But I would come back to the report. I really enjoyed reading this, and I appreciated that it was accessible and, it didn't dumb things down, but at the same time, it wasn't pretentious. And I think that, okay, let me take another step back. In all my years of research in this area, again, sustainability is something that is now coming up, and rightfully so. And it's a question that we need to talk about, and it's something that the general public needs to know about, as well as specialist technicians, scientists. And so, yeah, I really appreciated the report. I think that it could be really useful as a teaching tool, and it just brought together all of these issues, regulatory, scientific, looking out, looking back in. So yeah, I appreciate reading it, and thank you for inviting me on this. I'm trying to think if I have any general thoughts about regulation. I think I've kind of said that I was thinking. I think the background legal infrastructure is in place, but we need to really think about how to unpack and overlay regulation going forward. And I guess I would just say that I do feel like there is a space for resistance, and that's why I appreciate forums like this. Yeah, so thank you very much. And I look forward to distributing the report more widely.
Thanks, Jill. And that is a useful reminder that if the report is available on the Spacewatch website, so that's spacewatch.uk, So if you haven't already downloaded a copy, please go on and do so. Doug, do you have any final thoughts to wrap up with?
Well, firstly, it's been hugely interesting. It's the first time I've engaged with kind of space regulation and problems from an environmental point of view for a very long time, well over a decade, I would say, possibly 2 decades. That's just me. So thank you very much to Spacewatch. Thank you very much for Peter for inviting me on. I suppose, I'm always thinking about analogues and how that helps think about it. And I mean, there's a bit of me thinks you can see what's going on here, and it's not the first time where there's a race to develop something. There's a competitive edge. There's strong private players. There's governments potentially wanting to not interfere too much, and as Peter said, to be an enabler, a bit like deep sea mining, or currently, of course, AI, where you've got that dynamic going on. And I talked quite a bit about, kind of what is the objective and what's your route map, where are you going to get to? But there's also a bit of me that thinks, as a campaigner, you just have to metaphorically fling some mud against the wall and see what sticks. And I think for NGOs and campaigners who are, vastly out-resourced by the side that would like to either look the other way or is actively trying to make its own thing happen, I think that may be where it has to start, in some kind of low resource way, just to try and stimulate some interest in what's going on, often nominally in our name. And I think, as Peter said, would the population of Scotland be really pleased if they understood what was going on in their name? I'm not sure they would. Maybe they would, but I'm not sure they would. And transparency is the first calling point in a lot of this, something that AI is desperately trying to avoid in terms of its environmental footprint and wider impacts. Transparency brings sunlight. So if Rob and the ferret can keep going, then that's probably good news, and they need what support that we can give them.
Thanks, Doug. Peter, as the author of the report, you get the final closing remarks if you have any.
Okay. I think I need to thank, obviously, Jill and Doug very much for coming along, and their very helpful and very erudite comments. Thank you to you too, Helen, for chairing and keeping us in order, and for Chris behind the scenes, and also to everybody who's joined us tonight on the call. We're very pleased that you were willing to give up your time to speak to us. I think what I'd like to end up by saying is that the space industry represents the most powerful organizations and people on the planet. It represents the most powerful governments, their elites, their military elites, and China, America, the 2 biggest military countries, are also the 2 biggest players in space, and the military is the dominant area in which they're spending in space. The private entrepreneurs who are driving space, the likes of Musk, Bezos, Branson, Paulson, they're not doing it to help us. They're not doing it in our interests. They're doing it because they can make money and develop power for themselves. So this is not just about environmental campaigning. It's also kind of campaigning for the kind of world we want. It's campaigning against oligarchy. It's campaigning against militarism. It's campaigning against state dominance. So we have to look at it in those terms as well. It's about the kind of world we want to live in. Do we want to live in a, very boxed in technological world where we have very little freedom of action and we have to use sort of systems that are dictated to us by governments and by corporations where we're constantly under their control? Or do we want something better than that? So let's bear that in mind as well and use that to help inspire us and sort of push us forward to start challenging on some of these issues.
Thanks very much, Peter. I just wanted to finish by echoing Peter's thanks to everybody that's come along, but I'd also really like to thank the trusts who have funded this research and this work. We're a very small organisation, and without the funding, both large amounts and small amounts, we can't carry out this work and this research, which is really needed. And on that note, if anyone feels moved to donate, we'd of course be very grateful. You can find out details on how to do that on the Drone Wars UK website. And yes, download the report from Spacewatch UK. Thanks very much, everybody, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening.